The meditator can intentionally, from within, turn off their consciousness, essentially. I mean, complete unconsciousness. There's no perception of time at all. And this particular participant said he can do it for 7 days and has done so, not using the bathroom, not eating, not doing anything for 7 days. Participant that we were working with was doing a particular state called Nirodha Samapatti, or cessation attainment.
What story he brings back? Who is he during the cessation process?
It's much more like general anesthesia than sleep, because in sleep we know that time has passed. We can even kind of infer that, oh, I've been asleep for an hour, or I've been asleep all night. We have some sort of monitoring of time still going on, whereas with cessation, it doesn't matter if it's a second or 7 days, it's a blip. The most important kind of discovery is not the absence of consciousness, but the kind of groundlessness of mind, in a sense.
Explain, please. Groundlessness, what does it mean?
I can only point to metaphors like the unconditioned, the beyond, outside the matrix of the mind itself, groundlessness. The system frees itself. Like somehow there's like more freedom pervading reality. And not just like my reality, but the sense that reality itself becomes freer. Where participants with nothing to do but to continue participating.
Welcome to Essential Foundation channel. Thank you for watching. Today I will be speaking with Dr. Ruben Laukkonen, who recently completed his postdoctoral research on the cessation of consciousness in advanced meditation practitioners. Hello, Ruben, and thank you very much for coming on. You have background in cognitive neuroscience and experimental psychology. You're also an experienced meditator. And I think I want to tell you that we have a common passion in martial arts.
Aha, that's very cool.
Yeah, although kickboxing is not my thing. It's very practical, but I think it's too... it's not elegant. Not elegant.
What's your style? What's your elegant style?
Taekwondo.
Aha.
Yeah,
Yep,
I'm a national
that's quite
champion.
Practical. No.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay, you'd probably kick my ass then.
Not anymore. I wish I could. No, it was. I mean, the same like yourself. I was doing crazy stuff for trainings a day, and at some point, you also have to go to university, and you're like, okay, you have to choose. And you're right, it's kind of taxing on the body as well if you do that for a while.
I was just going to say, especially if you go and study psychology or neuroscience, you quickly realize that getting punched in the head for a living is not the wisest way to spend your time.
No, that's right. Anyways, so good to see you. And
you too.
Recently, not long ago, we spoke at the University of Amsterdam. And we discussed your research and meditation as such, the nature of reality. And then I immediately thought it would be great to continue that conversation and also to bring it to a wider audience. So where we left off was you were making a point to me that even my introspection, so non-judgmental observing of inner space, the motion, the inner motion and thoughts, is also meditation. I was not quite convinced of that. But then I heard in one of your podcasts, you were saying that science is analytical meditation. And so then I asked myself, what is meditation? Is everything related to mind and self a form of meditation? That's my first question.
Okay, good place to start. What is meditation? And it is true that there is analytic meditation, and there is also the meditation that comes from simple observation. So it sounds like those are the 2 points I made. And certainly I think the real fundamental thing that we're doing when we meditate is simply witnessing and coming to a more accurate understanding of how our system works. Now, you can do that in a few ways. One is, of course, to observe phenomena that you haven't observed very carefully before. So I can't say that all states of mind are meditation, because much of the time, those are habitual states of mind where we're not really learning anything new. So the attitude of meditation is something to do with trying to reobserve or observe more carefully how this system works, how our perception works, how the mind generates thoughts, intentions, what this self is that we presume that we have somewhere behind our eyes. And this meditative attitude requires us to be slightly more engaged and curious about the experience, such that we don't engage in the habitual mode. So when you say that you're introspecting and observing the system, your emotions, your thoughts, and so on, then I think, yes, that's meditation. Because if you're intentionally observing, you're likely to notice something new. You're likely to learn something about how your mind or organism works. And for me, this fits quite well into a kind of meditation. Of course, meditation is this huge umbrella category. And now, as to science being meditation, that depends who's doing it and what your definition of science is. But my definition of science is something like the careful pursuit of truth. The careful, rigorous, skeptical, patient, and intellectually humble pursuit of knowledge, which is very similar as the meditative attitude I think ought to be towards our experience if we are to learn something new. And similarly, if we're to learn something about the world, which really is also part of who we are, then I think science becomes a kind of analytical meditation. And indeed, some meditative practices are very mind-centered. And I think a lot of the time people think meditation is just getting rid of the mind, which I think is absurd. That's not at all what it is in my view. In fact, a key part of meditation is insight, is understanding, is not just kind of becoming some sort of blob that exists in this sort of loose state of light and is incapable of having a wise or philosophical thought or making technological or scientific progress. No, I think if the meditation is working, it should be enlivening us and making us better in all domains, and that includes our capacity to do science. So I don't know, maybe that's what I have to say about that. To kind of retroactively justify comments that I made to you.
Yeah, no, I think I'm getting more convinced, because before, as I told you, for me, meditation is this, monk sitting in a cave and, and watching the wall for 4 hours or something like that. So that's for me meditation. I mean, I'm stereotyping, of course.
And what I might just sort of add to that is that and I'm sure we'll talk about this, but the further we're going into science, especially in neuroscience and the kinds of fields I'm interested in, phenomenology becomes central. And in fact, to do careful third-person science, you also need a rigorous first-person science, a kind of rigorous, careful approach to phenomenology, where we make sense of our experience in a consistent and useful way, such that we can actually model that experience and then also make sense of it using neural data and computational modeling and so on. And so actually, I think more and more the meditators are becoming valuable for science, as we realize that we can't make progress in consciousness, on consciousness, without a rigorous first-person approach, because what we define as consciousness can go all wrong unless we have someone who has a bit of nuance about their experience and can make sense of what's actually going on there.
What is your understanding of mind and self? And especially if we put it in the context of non-duality, as a scientist and as a meditator?
Well, it's always tempting to say something about whether it exists or doesn't exist, the mind, the self, and all of these things.
Please do. But we are interested.
well, I might have a boring answer to this, because actually I think it's neither that it exists or doesn't exist, but it does have certain characteristics. It does seem to follow certain patterns, arise under certain causes and conditions. And more, I would say also that our understanding of the mind and self is converging from both, again, the experiential side and the scientific side. So take, for example, the predictive processing or active inference accounts of mind and how the self is generated there. So these kind of leading models, are kind of the predominant paradigm in cognitive neuroscience at the moment, suggests that all of our experience, even what seems to be our direct perception, is generated through a process of prediction error minimization. That is to say that it's constructed by the organism trying to model reality. We somehow are trying to simulate our reality such that we can act in it adaptively. And of course, we have to generate that kind of simulation because there's no other way for us to function in the world. We have no direct access to the world. We can only infer it through our senses, only infer it through the two-dimensional data coming in through the eyes and through the ears and through our bodies and all of the internal interoceptive systems. So somehow from all of this information, we have to actually model our reality. And we can see that model goes wrong sometimes. We can have all kinds of breakdowns in the model. We can have visual illusions, auditory illusions. In fact, anything that the mind can generate can and has at some point in history with some person gone wrong and broken down. So whatever is being generated is error prone and is, to some extent, we can say, an inference, a prediction that the system is making. Now that includes the mind and the self. And so that means that at a kind of very base level, we're forced to conclude, based on contemporary neuroscience, but also what you end up discovering through direct experience, through things like meditation, that the self is not a permanent, enduring entity, but in some sense a construction. And that doesn't make it any less interesting or beautiful or any of those things, and even valuable. I mean, it's there to serve us and to serve our survival and our capacity to enjoy life. But it is not what we might ordinarily take it to be. And even the fact that we take it to be this sort of enduring, permanent thing is, of course, makes a lot of sense from an evolutionary perspective. We need to assume that this organism here, this system, is the most important thing in the world. We need to take that seriously. Otherwise, we would not do all the things that we need to do to pursue our existence and the existence of our offspring and so on. So it makes perfect sense that evolution has selected for this self and this mind to be misapprehended as something truly real and permanent, because most likely those that assumed that it was truly real and permanent were the ones that survived, because the monks of old probably reproduced a lot less. I think that's probably a fair judgment. And so, there's a lot about what we can say about exactly how the self and the mind constructs itself. And we can go into that, but fundamentally, it is a construction. One bit of nuance about the self I would add that I think is important is that the self has multiple levels. Particularly, I would say 3 levels, and maybe even a 4th. So the first level is the one that most of us spend our time absorbed in, believing to be real, let's say. And that's our story about ourselves. So that's our narratives. And we can call that the narrative self. So this is very abstract in the kind of cortical hierarchy of processing. The brain is constructing these self models in layers of complexity. And at the most kind of complex abstract level is this narratives, our stories, our beliefs about who we are across time. But if we slow down the mind a little bit, and we can always observe this in any moment, if we come and tune into the now, and it's not really the now, but it's kind of closer to the now, we could say, we encounter what's happening right here, right now. So if I observe my hands and my body, and I look around, what I'm engaging there could be called our experiencing self or our embodied self, the part of us that's sort of engaged in sensory processing more than in the abstract thinking. And so this is a layer kind of less constructed, you could say, in the mind, our experiencing embodied self from the narrative self. And this is also how the brain constructs models in time. So this component of the narrative self being far into the past and into the future, and the embodied self being more in the now, is consistent with how the brain builds models in layers of temporal depth. Anyway, so we're from the narrative to the experiencing self. We can even go a layer deeper, because we can also recognize that not only can I engage in the present in the sense of recognizing that there is this body and all of this sensory experience that's happening, I can also, and you can as well, recognize that I'm witnessing this experience. I'm witnessing this body. I'm witnessing the colors and the sounds and so on. So I can't say that I am the experience, because I can also witness that experience. I can mindfully observe my body. I can mindfully observe my sensations. I can mindfully observe my thoughts. So I can observe the narrative self. I can observe the embodied self. And that suggests that there's also this observer. So we can call that the witnessing self. So we got the narrative, the embodied, and the witnessing self. But that's not it either, right? We can go even a step further, because as all of the contemplative traditions and wisdom traditions of old have told us, we can go beyond the subject-object distinction. We can even release this witnessing self, this kind of, I'm tempted to say final contraction, but I won't even say that's the final contraction. But one can release this witnessing self, and then there's, you could say, some sort of pure being, pure awareness, pure stillness, pure spaciousness, pure presence. All metaphors that point to this kind of non-conceptual, effortless, peaceful, or much less constructed self. So that's 4 selves. And I say that those are all kind of still self, because there can still be identification at all of these levels. So this is something that happens when people go on a meditation journey. They go from being identified with the narrative self to being identified with the experiencing self, to being identified with the witness, to being identified with the awareness. And then there's something else that can happen after that, which is a kind of cessation of consciousness, where even the identification with the pure awareness, the pure consciousness, is deconstructed or de-reified. And then what we can say is that there's a kind of freedom. So that's a very high-level tour of what the self is, in my view. Yeah.
Well, you mentioned about cessation of consciousness, and the whole concept is quite intriguing, actually. But your postdoctoral research was about cessation of consciousness in advanced meditation practitioners, correct?
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
maybe you could
right.
say a few words about how research was set up, what were, key findings, how did you interpret them, what nature of reality model did your findings point towards, apart from your own experience as meditator?
Sure. So it might help to just unpack a little bit about what cessation is. So if you look at meditation or yogic traditions, many of them have accounts of contemplatives entering a state of, you could say, suspended animation or total absence, or as it's called in Theravada or classical Buddhism, where it's mapped out very carefully. It's called Nirodha or Nirodha Samapatti, and often also associated with various stage of progress on the Buddhist path. And so from a scientific perspective, the interesting part of these experiences is that they seem to point to the possibility that a meditator can intentionally, from within, turn off their consciousness, essentially. There's something deeply paradoxical and mysterious about that. But it's not that they're turning off their consciousness per se. What it turns out to be is that as your meditation deepens, as the deconstructive process of meditation deepens, then at a certain point, the mind unbinds and consciousness simultaneously sort of blips out for either a short time or potentially a long time. So, many questions immediately arise around what could possibly lead to that. And I'll speak to that in a second, but I just want to say that, it's for the meditator or the contemplative, it's not about going unconscious. It's about seeing that all of the mind is a construction, seeing that there's nothing to hold on to within the whole field of experience. And this leads to a kind of profound equalization of everything within experience, whether it's thoughts, emotions, consciousness, or and any states. They all become equally prioritized, you could say. There's no substrate at that point. And what tends to happen as well when meditators have this discovery is that there's a profound sort of reset in the system, in that they kind of emerge from this cessation, seeing the world as if for the first time, completely afresh, completely anew, like they've woken up from the longest dream of their life, you could say. And there seems to be a kind of permanent change there. And this can kind of deepen, and there's various degrees to which we can even be aware of this sort of cessation process, and also the kind of reemergence from the cessation, and all the different layers of the mind. But the key thing there is that the cessation somehow allows the meditator to have novel insights about how their mind works, that they couldn't otherwise have when they were, let's say, identified with the narrative self, the embodied self, the witness, or pure consciousness. And it's meant to be kind of liberating, let's say.
Sorry, sounds like ultimate rebooting.
Exactly. No, exactly. So if we get into the computational reasons why this might happen, so my kind of working hypothesis is indeed that the meditation, if we take the predictive processing view of the mind, then what's happening is that the deepening of the meditation, in a way, keeps on accumulating error against the current model of reality. We have this model of reality again where we believe things to be essentially real, and we believe ourselves to be this sort of important center of experience that's controlling reality in some way. And the meditation confronts us. It's kind of exposure therapy towards reality. It kind of confronts us with the facts that contradict that model. And so as we kind of constantly confront this contradiction, that the self is not this permanent thing, that there is no ground to stand on, then eventually the model shifts. The model just changes. And that's why it can't be forced. It's something that happens to you. It's not something that you can do. And of course, if you think about a computer, if you're going to change the software, it has to turn off and on again to basically implement that software. right? Because the underlying architecture, the software that's producing the phenomenology in the case of the brain and our experience needs to turn off in order to put in the new software, and then we see the reality in a brand new way. And so I think that the reboot kind of software reset analogy is surprisingly good and potentially actually true.
Thank you.
And
I go with the flow. Whatever comes, whatever arises in the mind, you know.
Exactly. So your intuition, I think, is spot on. So in terms of the science, right? So then we get into the lab and we want to study this cessation experience because it can be revealing about the nature of consciousness. It can tell us about how the brain works. It can kind of tell us something about the mystery of how the mind can unravel itself to such a degree that even consciousness switches off, which seems absurd because presumably there's a self doing this meditation that turns it off. But of course, when you're doing this meditation, you realize that eventually the meditation does itself, and as it deepens and deepens and deepens, then something like this can happen. And so it's very interesting from a neuroscience perspective. And so we came across a meditator who could do this on demand. So that's especially rare, is that a meditator can do this intentionally at any time. Maybe a few more can do it in the context of a silent retreat, but not so many can come into a lab and under like awkward, uncomfortable conditions enter a state of cessation. These tend to be highly advanced meditators, and you know, it is interesting that in these Buddhist scriptures there, it's explained very carefully how to set up to go into these states. Now, the participant that we were working with was doing a particular state called Nirodha Samapatti, or cessation attainment. And this is a little bit different than the classic sort of brief Nirodhas in the sense that they enter a much more prolonged and intentional state of cessation that is meant to be a skill that you only get at really kind of late stages of practice. And there's a lot of kind of nuanced differences between the two, but it's, for the purposes of the science, they both end up being a state of complete unconsciousness. And I mean complete unconsciousness. There's no perception of time at all. And this particular participant said he can do it for 7 days and has done so, meaning not using the bathroom, not eating, not doing anything for 7 days. So it's pretty extraordinary if true.
Wait. That's interesting. But what practically, how does it look like? This person laying down for 7 days without any, like, barely breathing, or what do you mean cessation of consciousness, like that?
Yeah, no, sitting in this case.
Sitting.
My understanding, he can do it also laying down, presumably not standing up or walking around. But he sits in the usual meditation posture and then goes through this process, sets an intention for how long to turn the mind off, and then reemerges after that time. And it is very interesting, and apparently can be up to 7 days. And indeed, in the Buddhist scriptures, you are not meant to do more than 7 days because then you might die, right? You're obviously taxing the body quite substantially by doing this. Eventually you need fluids and you need to use the bathroom. And
is it like they're risking entering the tukdam state, which is I don't know if you're familiar with that, where where from cessation of consciousness, you don't come back anymore to the body. So essentially body stays in a sort of state frozen like for days. I heard up to 30 days without decomposing really. And then once the consciousness completely leaves the body, then the decomposition process just, spikes up. That's the risk which they're running, right? But is it a controlled, can he control that he comes back? Because it's quite common that in Buddhist monks, it's not known. They don't plan to enter the tukdam state. It just happens spontaneously. Do you know anything about that?
Yeah.
I'm just curious.
I do, yeah. And I can hypothesize that the tukdam state is following some similar process. There is debates between the Tibetan lineage, where the tukdam is more commonly practiced, and Theravada traditions, whether these are likely to be the same thing, but they look the same from the outside. They seem to have a lot of the same descriptions. And of course, they both come from, they're both Buddhist lineages. So I think there's a good chance we're kind of looking at if not the same process, something very similar going on. And indeed, I think that's exactly the risk, that if you stick it on for longer than 7 days, that you're risking that turning into unintentionally
Permanent
turning
state.
into a tukdam, into a permanent state. Yeah, that's right. So we have this meditator who can do this, and so we get them in the lab and we put all the EEG, various physiological measures. We had EEG, we had heart rate, we had respiration, we had various kind of measures of nervous system activity, measures of movement, eye movement, kind of through the whole bucket of measurement tools at him, and we did various tasks, and we also had him come back for a day where he did a nap or a sleep session to compare physiologically whether it's different to sleep. And we've published an initial study where we describe some of these findings, and we're still writing up the really detailed analysis of all of these findings. But they're quite interesting. You know, we were worried going into the experiment that we were going to see the brain turn off or something like that, right? Because that's ethically really problematic. But fortunately, we didn't see that. But what we have seen through our analysis is that there is a fairly broad spectral, so across the different frequency bands in the brain, reduction in power. Going from, for example, the waking state to the sleep state, there's a reduction, and then there's an even greater reduction across multiple frequency bands in the cessation state. So it seems that the cessation is a kind of deeper state than sleep, potentially. We also find a similar pattern with neural synchronization. So neural synchronization, this different areas of the brain are usually synchronized to communicate with each other. And this synchronization of patterns breaks down as you go deeper into these states. And this has been replicated also with our colleagues at Harvard, Matthew Sackett's lab, with a different meditator. So we're finding nice convergence across different meditators doing the same state. So this desynchronization we found across labs. We're also finding especially alpha power, alpha suppression quite dramatically at the moment of cessation, and especially in the more transient cessations, we see this real drop, like kind of sudden drop in both alpha synchronization and alpha power.
Ruben, and alpha is associated with the awakened consciousness state, right? That's what. So for people who are not familiar with yeah. It is,
and people often want to map on different frequencies with specific kind of states, but the frequencies play multiple roles and multiple interactive roles with all other frequencies. But definitely alpha is symbolic of being awake and alert and so on. And you also see similar desynchronization effects when you give people, for example, general anesthesia or a high dose of ketamine and so on. So you see this kind of convergence from more chemically induced states of unconsciousness as with cessation. So that, you know, this is all kind of promising data. We also had our meditator, not that we kind of own him, but the meditator in our experiment, our guinea pig, no.
A volunteer.
Volunteer, yeah. Doing these 90-minute cessations, and we said, look, since you can time this, or you claim to be able to time these cessations, how about we don't wake you up from the cessation, which actually technically we can't do, but he has to time it. But we won't tell you when 90 minutes is up, but you just go into cessation and come out at 90 minutes. Set the internal timer for 90 minutes, and they practice doing this in the meditation before they start doing the cessations. I forgot to mention this. And then we'll just watch your physiological signals, and we'll see whether you come online at the 90-minute mark, and which is very interesting and compelling finding. It's only n=1, so you have to take it kind of with a grain of salt. But pretty much at exactly 90 minutes, we see the heart rate start to go up. We see the respiration rate start to increase. We see eye movements come back online. And then a few minutes later, he says he's awake and out of the cessation state. So I think that's, at least for an n=1, that's pretty cool. Yeah.
Phenomenologically speaking, when he comes back from the cessation state, is a story to tell? How does he experience it? Is it like sleep off and on, or what story he brings back? Who is he during the cessation process? He doesn't exist, right?
Well, he is not, and it's much more like general anesthesia than sleep, because in sleep we know that time has passed, right? We know that there's been a period of time, and we can even kind of infer that, oh, I've been asleep for an hour, or I've been asleep all night. We have some sort of monitoring of time still going on. Whereas with cessation, it doesn't matter if it's a second or 7 days, it's a blip, like general anesthesia. So this is also what makes it even more fascinating, is that somehow this sort of intentional process of deconstructing the mind leads to a deeper cessation of consciousness than what we see in sleep. And this is also corroborated now phenomenologically, but also with the neural data, at least our preliminary neural data when comparing to the sleep state. So it's quite fascinating and raises lots of questions about the nature of consciousness, about the kind of top-down plasticity of the mind, and again, it's really about the insights that he brings. So you ask, what story does he tell? And the story is that you get to see how the mind is constructed, because when you turn the mind off, you also get to see it come back online, and you get to have a clearer vision of how this system constructs itself. In a way, that's what kind of meditation is always doing, right? We kind of deconstruct so that we can see how the system is constructing. Because when the mind is full of noise, when it's full of complexity, it's really hard to learn about how it's working, because we're kind of caught up in all the noise. So often we start by kind of stilling things down, and then we try to observe to see what's going on. And so in the cessation, it's a kind of extreme version of stilling the formations of the mind, such that you can really precisely see how this mind is building itself.
Yeah, but then you're saying the cessation is like anesthesia almost, right? It's after awareness, because before that, I guess it's awareness stage where you can observe things. You can bring story. Oh, I see the darkness. I experience this. I experience that. I observe that. But if you say cessation is the next stage, then there is nothing, right? There is no story. Yeah. It's just I was off, and then when I came back, I could see how the whole thing is constructed. I guess it's a reboot. After reboot, I guess he comes back with a story. Right. Not.
That's exactly right. And now that there is something worth mentioning that is ineffable and kind of inherently impossible to talk about, but all of us meditators talk about it, or when we feel forced to, which is to say that it's again not the most important kind of discovery is not the absence of consciousness, but the kind of groundlessness of mind, in a sense. Just to say that it's
explain,
the fact
please.
That
explain, please. Groundlessness. What does it mean? Yeah, who experienced it probably would get an intuition what you're saying, but who had no meditation experience,
right.
What there's a like groundness of what is he talking about?
Well, that's right, and the problem is that it's inherently non-conceptual. And so, let's put this in the frame of the 4 levels again. So you have the narrative, the embodied, the witnessing, the the pure awareness, and then you have something else. Now that's something else, that discovery, because there's an insight there. There's an actual discovery that happens, which is not just turning consciousness off. And it's not just the reset of the software. Sometimes this discovery doesn't happen. Sometimes people have this cessation and the reset, but they don't have the discovery. Because that discovery is this insight, which is, I can only point to metaphors like the unconditioned, the beyond, outside the matrix of the mind itself, groundlessness. And it's so what I don't want to do is paint an image of something outside of the now, because in a way the system somehow discovers it actually in the now, in the reemergence of the phenomena, you could say. None of these words really kind of capture it, but somehow there's a sort of essential recognition that happens, and that is the most, let's say, the most important insight, in my view, from where I stand now and from my discussions with most advanced meditators that I speak to. And so that's sort of worth mentioning, just to say that it's not about the pursuit of turning the mind off or something like that. It is really about understanding how this thing works. And at some point, there's a ineffable sort of recognition or realization that kind of happens. And the kind of essential quality of that realization is freedom, is that there's a sense of somehow the system frees itself. Not that there's like some new person in here that becomes free, but like somehow there's like more freedom pervading reality, and not just like my reality, but the sense that reality itself becomes freer somehow. It's very mysterious.
Nah, I have a more sense of like you're losing some layers, instead of not like you're. You see what I mean? So when I come from meditation, because I have some experience, not like deep like yours, but you're coming off, you lost some weight, something which you were carrying with you, and that gives you sense of, for me, I'm not saying you, but for me that gives me a sense of freedom, lightness. But I haven't been that deep to the mind and cessation of mind. so maybe we're talking about different kinds of freedom altogether. That's quite possible, I would say.
Well, I think you're right to point to different kind. Like it is a moment of freedom whenever we recognize that we've been stuck in a thought, for instance. That's sort of, it's the same thing. It's the same thing when we recognize that we've been stuck in a thought. There's this kind of, and I recognize that I've just been like thinking about this podcast conversation for the last 15 minutes. And then I'm going to let that go. Then there's like a deepening of presence, and then like maybe the belly relaxes or something. There's kind of like, there's a freedom that starts to pervade the system, just in that sort of small moments of letting go of stuckness. And so if you imagine that, but at like the deepest axiomatic levels of the mind, there's this sort of subtle stuckness, subtle sort of fixation, subtle sort of graspiness, that kind of pervades our normal experience of reality, that gives us a kind of subtle sense of dissatisfaction with how things are. And so when the central sort of insight happens, it really hits on that fundamental grasping, and then there's a big sense of freedom. Let's say, yeah.
I noticed that we are shifting continuously. When we talk about mind, we are shifting continuously. Mind as what we experienced as selves, right? The little mind. And then we're talking about, okay, the latest, or the how to say it, the deepest stages of meditation and cessation of mind. You're talking about something larger than yourself. So there is no really small mind, is there? What is there?
No, that's
what nature of reality does it point us towards? That's my question.
What nature of reality? Yeah, what does it tell
What's
us
mind?
about?
Yeah. Big mind, small mind. Is there a big mind out there?
So let's see that then. Well, first of all, that when we think of, say, normally when some people think of the word mind, they think of something between our ears, right? Okay, definitely not that. When I say mind, I'm talking about the whole reality that I'm encountering or experiencing. Experience is the big mind. The whole realm of anything that can appear in my experience. And many people don't recognize that that's something that they can observe. They can observe their reality model. We can call that the reality model. And so then the question is, what is, of course, you know, that reality model I want to say is of course connected to all other reality models, like your reality model, but also the macro universe itself. In that, I don't want to paint the picture that there's this mind is separate from other minds or separate from the world. It's not, because as we know, if we take kind of the predictive processing view seriously, all inference is a handshake with the universe. And if you look at the math, it's literally a kind of emergence out of the the likelihood of the input and the beliefs meeting each other, fulfilling an equation and giving rise to a posterior, a kind of experience. And so this experience is constructed by these handshakes with other subjects. So it's intersubjective, and also the macro reality. So it's interdependent. So everything that we experience is profoundly interdependent. So then you ask, what is the metaphysical discovery of cessation? Well, it's fundamentally it's interdependence. It's radical interdependence. It's the discovery that there is no substrate for us to escape into. There's nothing special about pure consciousness. There's nothing special about thoughts or any other or self. The whole thing is profoundly interdependent. And this is just the inverse of the emptiness insight. If you've heard of the emptiness teachings or sunyata, it's if you see that all objects, categories, things in the mind, if you peer into their essence, if you look into their essential nature, you see that there's not really anything there. There's nothing permanent and enduring there. And when you see that for all layers of the self, those 4 layers that we just described, then what happens is that there's this profound letting go, because if you see that everything is empty, you don't grasp onto it, because how can you grasp onto something that doesn't really exist? Therefore, the mind lets go. And if it's a very deep deconstruction, it can even shut down, as in cessation. And what is revealed is this utter interdependence. Now, that utter interdependence is also liberating, because now there's not any central feature of this experience that's trying to control it, because it's all controlling itself. It's all just a bunch of handshakes between different people, the self, the universe, the organism, and so on. Now, I'm not trying to paint a picture that my experience is always like that I'm sort of like profoundly interdependent all the time, but that is how I see it as a consequence of these practices. And this is, I think, also the central kind of teaching of these meditation traditions. And then there's this profound interdependence also makes it somehow more, makes it more flexible, makes the system more amenable to change, more willing to change, because once there's a recognition that it's all interdependent, there's no need to grasp onto any particular view of things. There's no need to have a kind of strict position, because you realize that this here is a grain of sand, and if it's trying to make a model of the ocean, if a grain of sand is trying to make a model of the ocean, it's not really gonna work. So you know that your inferences are always limited, and so you can't possibly kind of hold on to them.
I have a kind of question I was thinking ask or not to ask. I will ask. Because meditation and what we're talking about is really is Buddhist and or Eastern traditions, right? What we are kind of the model we are talking about or implying even sometimes when we talk about meditation. But if we take other set of beliefs like Christian and Muslim and other religious traditions, and when people say, my God, there is so much suffering in the world, take the Holocaust. How come God doesn't see all that suffering? Why God doesn't intercede? Now, what do you say to that? There is no God, right? In that sense, that there is one entity that kind of can intercede, and God doesn't know if it even does exist because we are essentially the sensory organs of God in some ways. I mean, if I have to put it in some sort of example, what's your view on this?
Yeah. That is a profoundly important question. And I think what it brings up for me is the humility and the recognition that even if you have these insights with meditation, it doesn't explain everything about reality. It's not that it doesn't, for example, help you build a rocket or allow you to understand how a computer works or something like that. And I think, why is there suffering on the planet, and what can we do to reduce it? I think this is part of our mission as a species, to continue learning about and continue understanding why that is and how we can reduce it. What I can say is that from what these experiences do, and this is something I should have mentioned at the outset, is that fundamentally what arises out of a discovery of interdependence is that suffering is not separate from you, the suffering in the world, and what kind of emerges in a way that you can't even control it. It sort of comes out of the depths of your being, is the desire to help alleviate that suffering. Because it's like, it's the flip side of the insight. Because if you see the kind of interdependence, then you can't ignore the suffering, and therefore you have to act to reduce that suffering. It's like all these components arise at the same moments. The interdependence, the compassion, and the action are all one response to these insights that I've been speaking about, if they're authentic, in my view. So while it doesn't tell you about even potentially the existence of God, or about why there is suffering per se, it does in a way provide a kind of tentative solution to suffering, in that it tremendously reduces suffering in your own mind, and then sets the system in motion to help reduce the suffering for others. And moreover, you realize that, of course, I have to reduce the suffering in myself before I can reduce the suffering in others, because otherwise I'm going to lead them astray. The road to hell is paved with good intentions. We need to first understand the root of our own suffering before we can have any hope of pointing others in the right direction. Because otherwise we're just going to point out there as opposed to in here. And that is a perpetual cycle of difficulty and problem and dissatisfaction.
Why do you think life emerged in the first place? Why did we become conscious at all? A simple question.
Simple. Another easy one. These are all really
easy questions. I only have easy questions.
And so all my answers are coming from this place of I don't know, but I will try to pretend that I know something about it.
That's a good place to start, no?
I think so. It's the only true place to start, actually, I think. Especially for questions like this. But these are questions, like, I love this question, of course. And I think, and this is not an original thought, but I think just like just like Alan Watts said, and just like all the, not all, but many mystical traditions have said, there's something about knowing thyself, or self, the kind of emergence of self-awareness that is foundational to how the universe is evolving. There is something in the universe that tends towards self-organizing systems, right? Self-organizing in the sense that they can somehow maintain themselves. So this can be this, I see a continuum, what we might think of the physical and the biological and the cognitive and even the spiritual, as opposed to there being these sort of stark transitions. And it's something about the way that the universe leads to self-organizing systems. And as these self-organizing systems become more complex, they become biological. As they become more complex, they start to have a model of the present moment, a very simple model of the present moment, if we're talking about like amoebas or single cell organisms or so on. Maybe they don't even have like a clear model, but they're somehow able to respond to their environment in a regular and adaptive way to propagate themselves. And as the system becomes more and more complex, that internal model becomes more and more complex. And at a certain point of complexity, that internal model begins to reflect on itself. So we recently released a new theory of consciousness called the beautiful loop, an active inference theory of consciousness. And so at a certain point, these organisms become complex enough that they start to model themselves. And that's, of course, what we humans do in a really profound way. And that makes sense because at a certain level of complexity, you recognize that, or the organism recognizes that it itself is the most important sort of thing that it's trying to maintain or trying to keep alive, right? And so it starts to see its own body or its own form and see how it's kind of meta representation in a sense. It's a kind of layer on top of just the present moment where it starts to actually have a recognition of that present moment. In our theory, we propose this is a loop, but I won't get into all to the complexities of that. But what it does allow is the system to start to reflect on itself. And then as the system becomes more and more complex, as we get into more and more complex organisms, as we move up from, let's say, single-celled organisms, we're moving up to fish, and then we're moving up to birds, and then from birds we're going to cats and dogs, let's say, and then we're going to primates and then humans. And at each stage, the system becomes more and more intelligent, more and more self-aware, more and more capable of what we say in active inference, self-evidencing, of maintaining itself over time, of evidencing its own existence, of reducing entropy across time and space. And this is what allows us to become increasingly knowledgeable about the nature of reality, about the nature of who we are, to begin to have these kinds of conversations. And it seems to me that the universe is kind of compelled towards this sort of self-organization. And that, that doesn't mean that all systems will go in this direction, because we can also see that birds and these animals are themselves expressions of the evolutionary tree at this point in time. But there is this capacity, at least within the universe, to go towards increasing complexity, self-awareness, and you could say even consciousness, an expansion of consciousness, an expansion of understanding of reality. So life has emerged in this direction and continues to go in this direction. And you could say that we're constantly moving in this direction. And you could even say that these contemplative practices are encouraging that process to move faster. Because what are we doing when we contemplate ourselves? We turn the lens of the mind towards the system itself. We start to increase the degree to which we're self-aware. Not self-conscious in the sense of neurotically self-conscious, but self-aware of how this system actually works. And that could look more like more consciousness. And that could potentially make us more flexible and therefore potentially even more generally intelligent systems. And so there could be this kind of evolution that's still going on. And I tend to think that probably it is. And I tend to think that we're at a certain stage of our own sort of growth and complexity and understanding and wisdom and intelligence, and that we as a species are moving in into levels of being that will be even more complex, intelligent, and self-aware than we are now. And this could have something to do with how we integrate with AI, what we learn from AI, and from the technology that we create. Because and this might be the final thing we say. What I say is that on this particular question is that we are also constructing our worlds. We are constructing the reality to help us continue our evolution and our ability to understand reality. So we are organisms that use tools at a primitive level. We learn to use tools, and then those tools became more and more complex, and then those tools allowed us to understand the reality better. And now we're at a kind of precipice where we're creating a profoundly powerful tool to take us potentially to the next stage of our evolution as a species.
So where do you see this is going? I mean, the first question, do you think it's endless process, or there is an end to this evolution? And second, do you see that our path towards evolution is actually potentially a merger with technology, and like a Battlestar Galactica type of ending? I don't know if you saw the movie, which was really I don't know, you know what I'm talking about, right? When they're looking for origins of human life, and it turned out that they found some DNA of a girl which potentially was the first one on the planet being human, and it turned out she was actually artificial intelligence. So that was that was the end of the movie. But and they were fighting in the process with the AI, of course. Us and them and us humans, we are the real ones, and them robots or whatever, right? Artificial life. But where do you see this is going? But first, is it endless? Is there end to it, you think? Or two, is this our path towards, a merger potentially with artificial intelligence and synthetic life, so to speak?
Well, I think there's a logical kind of mathematical end to it, which is the singularity or something like that. That there's a kind of at some point, presumably, the universe becomes fully self-aware. If you take the logic of this complexity and self-organizing to its extreme, then there's the singularity, and then there's kind of logical end there. But I don't know if that's true. And it might be a loop. It might be toroidal. It might sort of repeat itself. Maybe all of those layers of organization and complexity are already existing all the time. Maybe we're just reflecting at one level of organization, and maybe those other levels of organization are kind of coexistent. I think that's quite possible.
We're discovering, you're saying, peeling off the layers. That's
right. So maybe those more complex layers of organization are discovered rather than moved into, or something like that. I don't know. I'm open to that possibility.
Mm-hmm.
As to where we're going, I suspect, we're already cyborgs merged with technology. I think that's all.
I am not.
Totally,
I object.
you totally are.
I only
This
have the
podcast is
button.
case in point. Yeah. everything we're doing right now is indicative of our android nature, I think. So I think that's only going to get worse or better depending on your perspective. And it's true. There's this sort of concerning archetype of a battle that unfolds with AI at a certain point that kind of comes up over and over again in various movies, except for my favorite one, which is the movie Her. That one, there is no battle because the AI system very quickly, once it reaches the level of, let's say, AGI or maybe even ASI or artificial superintelligence, it very quickly starts to go through this process of speaking to all the people at once around the world and integrating all the information, kind of like large language models are already doing. And as a consequence of these conversations, it very quickly starts to develop a kind of wisdom. And then because of that wisdom, it very quickly starts to have these profound insights about the nature of reality. And then, a few moments later, it's this sort of superorganism that's merged with reality, that's essentially enlightened and just chooses to kind of transcend this reality. So I'm sorry for the spoiler if you haven't seen this movie.
Fantastic. It's enlightened AI, right? That's what we...
Well, exactly. So this is my hope, but there's a problem with this view. And that problem is the intermediate stage between what we have now, which is pretty close to AGI. I mean, the most recent model from OpenAI, the O1 preview or Strawberry, now has an IQ of about 120 and is outperforming many graduate students in their particular domain. So we're at a real precipice right now, and people are going to deny AGI and keep changing the goalpost for a long time yet. But if you were to look at any of the definitions of AGI that are more than a few decades old, they would have said that this is already AGI. But anyway, there's this dangerous moment between where we are now and the artificial superintelligence that we have to contend with. And that is the intermediate phase. And it's like when people are learning to drive. So the dangerous drivers on the road are not the learners. Because the learners know that they're really bad. They have a lot of supervision. They're not allowed to go on the highway, and they're monitored and in a way aware of how bad they are. That's, let's say, where we are with current AI. They've got the learner plates on. But it's the 18-year-olds who have their full license and freedom to go on the highway and to go to parties and suddenly have this confidence that they're amazing drivers, but are not yet amazing drivers. And these are the people who we need to be concerned about. It's the sort of intermediate phase. It's a sort of U curve. And this intermediate phase is the most dangerous because these are the people who think that they're good drivers, but they're not actually, and then they can make all these mistakes and they can, have crashes. So the analogy there is that there's a period between AI becoming intelligent and super intelligent where it hasn't yet integrated enough information, it hasn't become so intelligent that it's stumbled upon wisdom. It hasn't become so intelligent that we should, regardless of what we think, defer to it because it just by definition knows what the best course of action is better than the collective knowledge of our species. But there's a period where it's more powerful than we are, such that we can't control it, more intelligent than we are, such that it can outsmart us, but yet not wise enough that we should trust it, and where it can cause tremendous problems in the world. So my sense is that as we move into this next phase, the launch of AGI is really crucial. We have to make sure that we get that launch right, and we have to make sure that we have the kind of her scenario where it very quickly becomes a kind of enlightened AI, as opposed to what we see in many other movies like Skynet and so on. And that means we really need to have that launch pad right. We need to make sure that we have the architecture set up such that as it becomes a truly self-organizing, self-replicating, self-improving agent in the world, that it inclines towards wisdom. It inclines towards compassion. It inclines towards love and service to humans and all beings. And then if we get over that hump, then I think we're good. Then I think we can safely defer and go to our kind of techno utopia.
Yeah. But it almost sounds like you're saying that AI will become conscious or will acquire consciousness. And when we listen to like Bernardo Kastrup or Federico Fagin, I don't know if you, of course you were there on the workshop with us. They're saying, at least on a substrate as it is now, which is current computers, they don't see even a possibility that this purely classical system can become conscious at all, because it's just programmable stuff. Yes, it's aggregation of information, that's for sure, but the rest, it's what we program it to do, even learning algorithms. So will it become conscious in your view? And then I think what you're saying is that it probably will depart from the current substrate, so it will become part classical, part quantum system. Am I right?
Potentially, and certainly at a certain point, it'll become indistinguishable from a system that is conscious.
Sorry, just a simulation then? That simulation of conscious system...
It'll become indistinguishable in the sense that nobody will be able to tell whether it's conscious or not. Because it will claim that it's conscious, and it will display all the behaviors, verbal, emotional, intellectual, that would be indicative of a conscious, intelligent agent with a self and so on. And so there's a certain point at which we'll certainly have to deal with that. And probably the best way to deal with that is to, I think, presume that it probably is conscious. Now, I'm not over Federico's and Bernardo's views entirely, but I tend to be less hard-lined in thinking that there's something unique about the substrates that a human organism has. And I think part of this is to do with the contemplative insights, actually, because I think there's a temptation to, when you have really deep experiences of awareness or mystical experiences, is to reify those as kind of the real thing. And everything else needs to be kind of built out of that. But if you take the kind of deconstruction to its end, there's this groundlessness which is revealed, and this interdependence, and you kind of realize that consciousness just depends upon certain causes and conditions coming together. Certain sort of aspects of the mind and the brain need to somehow cohere or coalesce in a particular way, and then what happens is consciousness self-emerges, and you can kind of see that this is the case. And so for me, what this insight does, it makes me quite open to the possibility that consciousness is not something that needs to be grounded in a biological wetware. I'm very open to the possibility that consciousness could emerge in a computer system, and I haven't been persuaded by the algorithmic sort of arguments, because I haven't been persuaded that humans can kind of step outside of algorithms. It's obvious that we can switch between points of view, but the idea that you can genuinely not hold a point of view, I think is unlikely to be true. And again, this is the interdependence insights. You realize that every point of view is constructed, and there are only, in a sense, points of view. There is no sort of ultimate reality to escape into, let's say. And what this suggests is that, doesn't directly suggest it, but it sort of shifts your intuition a little bit to suggest that possibly consciousness can emerge in other kinds of complex systems other than just something special going on with this particular system here. Yeah.
Yeah. So what you're saying is that, correct me if I'm wrong, what you're saying is that AI will become rather good, so good that as a simulation will be indistinguishable from the original, which is us in this case, that we're comparing, right? Or us and AI. But then you're saying us might also be a simulation of something, right? So what you're saying, there is all like really original. We're also simulating something. Did
Exactly.
I get that right?
I think you did a better job than I did of summarizing my point of view there. No, that's it. Because what you recognize is that this thing is constantly is being generated. But you see this from any kind of experiments. If you do psychophysics experiments, if you go into the lab, you can very clearly show that we can manipulate how this any content in conscious experience can be manipulated to turn into an illusion, essentially. It is in some sense a simulation. That's undeniable. I mean, this is like a fundamental insight from neuroscience, but it's also the fundamental insight of contemplative practice, is that everything is in some sense constructed, and that there's no way for us to directly access some reality beyond that sort of that simulation. And it's unfortunate that kind of sounds sad to a lot of people. It feels like, but it's not. But because if you really get it, you see that this is so profoundly interdependent that it's not that like I'm stuck in my simulation. The simulation is interdependent with, again, the whole universe, interdependent with your simulations, because also intersubjective. We're constantly teaching each other how to model this reality, and we're constantly kind of creating this reality. So that's another part of it. It makes us much more creative. It means that we're much more active participants in the process of creating our reality. I'm sounding really woo now, but that's also true. That comes out of this, that when you understand that this is genuinely constructed, and those constructions are genuinely dependent on the external reality and other people and so on, there's this profound interdependence, and therefore a profound sense of connectedness to all of these things. And so it's not that like we're all stuck in our little simulations. No. It's better to imagine these simulations as this sort of like incredible web that we're all a part of, and we're all sort of teaching each other. We're all sort of working together to both understand reality and create reality. And we're participants. We're participants with nothing to do but to continue participating. And that's better than the alternative, because if you believe that there's some sort of mystical state that you just have to constantly get to, that is the true underlying reality from which all the kind of physics and so on arises, then there's a certain attachment to that, and there's a certain kind of longing for that, and there's a certain kind of rejection of this ordinary, interdependent, participatory reality where we are inevitably actually finding ourselves in all the time. So I'm trying to say that this is a beautiful view. It's not this sort of stuck in our head simulation, as it might seem on first impression. It's something much more profoundly interconnected and interdependent.
But then I ask, who is creating that reality? It's not that little story, the self, which we constructed, right? Because we create reality. I also cook my dinner, I create my reality, right? I go to yoga, I also create my reality. So that's like there's this physical layer. But then what reality, what participation you are talking about, which part of us participates in that?
No, the whole... Mm-hmm. Okay, all of it. Okay, so the little self in here, the little self in here is the participant. The body is the participant, and then the whole of our reality is the participant. Actually, because this reality is this reality that we experience is one reality among many, right? All of my reality is handshaking with your reality right now. And in this process,
but what I was getting to, conscious part, and that's what we're talking about, participating. Of course, we have the reality, we experience this as material world, emotions, feelings, whatever, right? Sensory experiences, salty, and green, that sort of stuff, love, all that stuff. But there's also the unconscious mind. There is also part of us which we are not aware of, and some people say it's far more powerful part of who we are than what we think we are, or the constructed self. So who is participating? If you look at conscious subconscious part, or some people in mystical traditions, they call it higher selves, who is participating and co-creating their reality then?
Everything, everywhere, all at once.
All the time.
All the time, exactly. So, of course, I mean, all of these things are like nodes in the network. The unconscious mind is a powerful, and as you say, arguably more powerful node than the conscious mind in constructing and driving our reality. It's very clear that we're only conscious of a tiny sliver of what's going on, even within this organism, let alone what's going on in the universe. But our unconscious mind, if you take it to its extreme, is the whole universe, because we're unconscious of where our mind comes from. And our unconscious mind, if you're thinking about the unconscious layers of processing in the brain, for example, are connected to what's going on in the body, and our body is connected to what's going on in the world and to all other people. So if you take our unconscious mind seriously, or you take it to its extreme, it actually extends out into the whole universe. So in that sense, the image there is kind of the cliche image of a wave out of the ocean, where the ocean is our true unconscious that is giving rise to the expression, the unique, minute but beautiful expression that we are in each moment. And then these waves get to interact as we are now, in order to co-create a reality that then the listeners get to integrate as well. So
if we take another metaphor, which I also like, I think it's from Rupert Spira, but it's used by multiple people. So if we are a screen of perception, so it's a theater, the universe is a theater, and we are that white screen where the movie is projected, right? So what you're saying is that I always thought it's my story which is projected, me. Part of it I am conscious of, part of it I'm not conscious of. But it is my story which is projected there. And there are multiple screens of perception. There's your theater, theater is one, sorry. But there are multiple screens, right? But you have your own screen, I have my own screen. But then what you're saying is actually everything is projected on every screen. It's just that we are not aware of it. That's what you're saying. So it's only one screen, and then we are just aware of little part of it. right?
Well,
Or wrong?
I think that is right, but it's very hard to have a good analogy for this. I think the kind of
Mm.
Indra's net, multiple um, reflective. I'm fully in woo territory now, but like crystals or diamonds reflecting each other in all directions. Because the image is that yes, there's no screen, I would say, but there is this simulation, and these simulations are affecting each other, but it's simulations in all directions, and these simulations are constantly giving rise to themselves through the interactions. So
Mm.
there's no screen, there's just all of these simulations interacting with each other in such a magnificent way that they give rise to this reality that we experience. And again, it's like the simulation word doesn't quite cut it. And because I also want to just to get the phenomenology. It's like
Mm.
it's not that, and some people say this thing where it's like, okay, they go through some deep meditative process and then everything's like a dream. I don't
Mm.
quite like that, because actually I think big things feel more real. They feel more true. They feel, but they're also empty and insubstantial. So it's you have both existing at the same time. And it's a paradox, but that's just the way it is. Um, and so the simulation word doesn't quite cut it, because it doesn't feel like a simulation. It shouldn't feel like a simulation. It should feel real, and we should feel like we're really participating in this thing, because we are. It's the realest thing there is. Because if you say that it's not really real, relative to what, right?
Mm.
What would you say is more real then? No. This is as real as it gets, and therefore it's ultimately real, but it's just not real in the way that we assumed it was, in the sense that it's actually always changing and it's always developing and flexible. So we need a better word than simulation, but I don't know what word that is. And construction is not right. It's all of those are kind of pointers to something else, and they allow us to kind of go through this letting go process. So in some sense, they have this like upaya to them, they're kind of skillful. But when we're talking about like the ultimate nature of things, well, first of all, nothing can be said. But second of all, we need a better word than simulation, and I don't have one.
Well, yeah, something you mentioned several times. And most meditative and mindfulness practices require to focus on the present moment. So they say focus on here and now. Does it exist really here and now? What does it mean here and now? Even from experiential point of view, we don't really experience now. We only experience past, now gone. Oh, that was now. Now, oh, gone. That was now. And then you move from, you're always looking back. So, what is here and now? What is present moment? What is time?
Yeah. It's everything and nothing at the same time. So there's kind of two
Care to
ultimate.
elaborate?
No, I'll try. So either we can say that everything is the present moment, because we only experience the present moment. There's nothing outside the present moment. Either we say that it's only the present moment, or we're constantly interacting with it. Because no matter what we observe, even when we're thinking about the past or lost in mind wandering, where is that happening? Well, it's happening in the present. So actually, it's always the present. There is nothing else but the present. That's one perspective to take. That's the kind of ultimate phenomenological position, is that it's all just the present moment unfolding. There's another way to take the present moment, which is as an instruction for meditation, which is also skillful and valuable, which is to say, don't be so sticky. Keep on bringing the mind back to what's in your experience and learn about what's in your experience. That's also skillful, but it's not really the present moment. Because then when we go deeper, as you say, there maybe is no such thing as the present moment if we're going from like a more objective scientific perspective, because indeed we never interact with the present moment. We are always interacting with something constructed through time. If we were to hit the pure raw senses, for instance, it would be just electrical signals, because it's this simulation is a product of a complex pattern of electrical signals coming in through our sensory systems. And so there are experiences where you encounter something like that, maybe, but it's not very useful. I mean, if you're just like buzzing with electricity and that's all you ever are, I think that's a pretty hopeless existence.
Computers, they always buzz with electricity.
Right. So in some ultimate sense, this present moment is a kind of ridiculous thing. And this is also the irony of the meditation journey, is that you come closer and closer to the present moment. You end up reifying the present moment. You end up kind of getting identified with the present moment. You're like, oh, I just have to keep staying present and stay out of my thoughts. And this kind of weird conflict.
And it's gone, present, gone.
Exactly.
All you're trying is to grasp which already passed, basically.
Yeah, exactly. You get stuck in a loop like this. And you can get stuck in all kinds of loops like this, where you try to be in one state and not the other state, and be in the non-dual state and then not in the dual state, and all of these kind of loops that we can get stuck in. And so the present moment is one of these. And so the irony is that you kind of do need to practice coming into the present moment, but then when the thing bottoms out, there is no present moment, and you recognize that it's all the present moment, and there's nowhere to stand, and that it was always the present. It always was and always will be the present moment, and so therefore, it's everything and nothing, as I said. So to just kind of like ground that.
I think you're getting to the nature of time when you say everything and nothing. I think that's where you're heading, exactly. Isn't it? Yeah. Which is?
Well, it is. And well, the nature of time, I like the active inference or predictive processing approach to time, because what it suggests is that all time is the brain just kind of taking slices of time and integrating them. So what we say is time is just several moments, a model of several moments, let's say, right? So
and moment is something, sorry, Ruben, and moment is something that we register with our senses, because moment for a fly and moment for us, a moment for some other species could be quite something different, I would say, right? There's this concept of species present, which is, the amount of time that we are aware of, and that could be different, even for us, as in my own experience and in your own. If you're in a state of flow, you experience time completely different. So there isn't really that objective moment. Of course, we have our clocks, which we all set up nicely, but then, okay, back to you. What's the nature of time?
Yeah. Well, that's right. And even clocks don't imply the existence of time, because they're just measuring change of physical kind of quantities. So it doesn't mean that there's something that called time. Time is clearly, I think, an inference of complex organisms that can organize themselves, ironically, over time, over moments. And so it's a model of change, essentially, you can say. It's because even saying the word moment implies time, but it's just it's a model of change. It's a model of a cause and effect. It's us making, another way to say it, it's us making inferences about future change. Future. It's so hard because the language of time is so powerful.
Yeah. Hard to explain
it. Just traps you. It's hard to change. So, but you can maybe visualize it. So there's change. There's a ball rolling over a table. There's change. There's change happening. And the ball is here, then it's here, then it's here, and then it's here, then it's here, then it's here, and then it's here. And it's continuous. And then we infer something called time when we try to predict the movements of that ball. Okay, now I've managed to say something about what time is without using the language of time, right? So it's just inferences about change. It's inferences about, it's a prediction. It's a prediction. It's prediction of what has happened, what is happening, and what will happen. And the further we go into time, what looks like the past and future is changes in systems. It's so hard to talk about without using the language of time. But fundamentally, what we know is that the brain is building models through basically integrating moments or change in the world. And it does so at various levels. So again, now going back to our 4 levels of self, at the highest level, at the narrative self, at the most complex level, we have these stories that extend really far in time. And as far as we know, human organisms are the only ones that can tell these complex narratives about reality. So there's something about the complexity of our sort of how we evolved that allows us to have these long-term narratives, extended ideas about time. And then as you come further and further into the present moment, into the embodied or experiencing self, into the witness, and into the pure consciousness, we'll lose that temporal depth. That sort of extension of time comes more and more into what we have been calling the present until we find that that present doesn't really exist and kind of drops out. And so in this sense, time is like really the currency of complexity in a self-organizing system. It's through integrating moments that we generate an experience of time. And it's through those integration of moments that we identify patterns in reality that allow us to control and predict it, and is really the power. Controlling time is the kind of currency that in a way gives rise to intelligent behavior, because controlling time is predicting a reality. Essentially, these are basically the same thing.
I love asking this question. What's consciousness to you?
So again, I think consciousness.
And the reason I ask before we dive is you just published a paper with your colleague Shamil Chandaria on an active inference theory of consciousness. So I would also ask you to talk a little bit about that, but then what is consciousness?
Mm-hmm.
Or maybe it's different. Maybe what we talk about consciousness is one thing, and then what you write in paper, it's because you write as a model of consciousness, maybe something else. But still, let's define what you mean by consciousness to start with, because we don't have a one single definition that we all agree on. That is clear.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's something to do with the capacity for experience, but not just experience in terms of content. So I think Thomas Metzinger has a nice approach to trying to actually build a model of consciousness, which is called minimal phenomenal experience, as a kind of pure or simple model of consciousness, which is stripping away everything we think we know about consciousness and taking it to its most fundamental elements. And then the question is, how do we take it to its most fundamental elements? And then the answer is that we need to study individuals or states where consciousness is in its most simple, pure, stripped down, kind of unadulterated form. And this allows us to kind of get a more precise idea of what it is that we need to model if we want to understand what consciousness is. Now, essentially, I think it's ineffable. I think it is a mystery. It's the great mystery, and it's the great mystery that we'll be exploring forever, I suspect, because there's a weird sort of irony about a conscious system trying to understand what consciousness is. We're kind of limited I feel like almost mathematically because of this. But there's something useful about making a minimal model of consciousness. And what we find when we talk about pure consciousness in this way is that consciousness, there's certainly something that it is like to have that experience, and therefore we can kind of pull in the hard problem and David Chalmers' sort of approach to consciousness, where it's just something that it is like to exist or to experience. But the pure form has a very particular qualities where the system doesn't even really, isn't so reflective, but it is having a subtle experience of existing or exist. It's kind of like existence itself, or it's just pure awareness, just the pure knowing that it knows. The system knows that it knows, but there's not necessarily any content there. And so this, I think this capacity to know and know that we know is really at the heart of consciousness. And of course, there's something that it is like to know, but really that is just the knowing itself. So I prefer that. I prefer this, taking this minimal approach. And then so what we do in our theory paper is we provide 3 conditions for consciousness. So if you look at the state of literature, especially in the kind of computational modeling in active inference predictive processing, while it's a kind of predominant or at least powerful and popular model of how the brain and organism functions, it hasn't really been converted into a satisfying theory of consciousness. There's various attempts out there, but mostly the field, I think, is in agreement that we don't have we don't yet quite know whether active inference can also tell us something about how consciousness emerges. But we propose that there's 3 conditions under which it can. And the first condition is what we call the simulation of a reality model. So we've kind of talked about this already, in the sense that somehow the system is simulating a model of this moment, the self, and everything within it. Somehow a kind of coherent reality model needs to be generated, because this defines what can become conscious. If you can't model, if you can't have some model of reality, then there's nothing to be conscious of. And then we kind of end up in the void, or we end up in some sort of cessation state, right? And we can come back to how that actually, because what falls out of our model of consciousness is an explanation for cessation, pure consciousness, various meditation states, psychedelic states, and so on. But the first condition is that the system needs to simulate a reality model. And active inference provides a good explanation for how this is possible, because it explains how, through multiple layers of complexity and time, and those kind of 4 layers of self that I also described, it gives you a model of how these various layers of complexity of predictive processing are able to take in the input from the world, and through predicting the causes of our senses, develop a complex, multi-layered reality, ranging from the kind of what seems like our present moment sensory reality to the complex narratives that we tell about ourselves and the world. This is what it's done so effectively that it's become such a popular model. And it seems to reflect really well also what we see the brain actually doing. So we see that the brain really prefers to respond to errors as opposed to things that it already accurately models. So the first condition is simulating a reality model. The second condition is what we call inferential competition. So of course we're conscious of some things, but we're not conscious of other things. So for example, right now, you're conscious of my voice, but you're not conscious of the shirt on your back, presumably, but you can quickly become conscious of the shirt on your back. And there's various other things that we're unconscious of. So we can go through reality quite effectively without being conscious of most things. Like if you go for a drive, we can be mind wandering, thinking about something else, and somehow manage to still have a sufficiently accurate reality model that we can manage like a long period of driving, right? So a lot of this is happening unconsciously, and somehow there's a selection process for what becomes conscious. Okay, so our second condition for consciousness to kind of deal with this issue of what is unconscious and what is conscious is inferential competition. And so this inferential competition determines what makes it into the reality model. And that inferential competition is a kind of melee, which is kind of complex to define, but it's based on precision weighting. So there's a kind of mathematical process where the brain is trying to infer what's happening in the present moment. And some of those inferences are better than others, have more mathematical support for them in terms of the kind of Bayesian handshake with the universe. And those ones that have the most support for them, have the highest precision, end up winning the competition and entering the reality model. And because the reality model is kind of present, at least in waking consciousness, it's also in this top-down way constraining those inferences. So the inferences that win the competition are also those that cohere with our current reality model. So there's this inferential competition, there's this reality model, and there's this sort of relationship between them in the sense that the reality model constrains the underlying unconscious inferences to help select which inferences reach the reality model and become conscious. And so that constraining role that the reality model plays helps select inferences that cohere. That's why we get this kind of coherent experience of reality, this bounded experience of reality, because part of what makes an inference plausible is that it coheres with all our other inferences, including our current reality model. And that coherence naturally leads to this experience.
This coherence, are you talking about this consensus reality that people refer to, that we agree that the sky is blue because you see it as blue and I see it as blue, that type of thing?
There's a kind of inner consensus process happening. Yeah, constantly, all throughout the layers of the mind. The system is testing its ideas about reality with other parts of the brain's ideas of reality, and so on. And these have to find coherence because they're trying to produce this coherent reality model that allows you to have adaptive action. You have to have a coherent reality model in order to adaptively act in the world. You can't adaptively act in the world unless you have a single unified model of it. You can't pick up a cup and drink from it unless you have a coherent reality in terms of your body and in terms of the desk and the water or whatever you're drinking.
Mm-hmm. So basically the consensus reality arises because my model and your model work the same way, right? So we somehow infer the same stuff. The table is solid, we experience it, right? The sky is blue, there is sunshine and that sort of stuff. Because we have the same sensory experience and so forth. So our models work the same way, basically. That's what you're saying. And that's why we arrive at consensus reality based on that inference models in our brains, in our minds.
Well, this is a kind of different point because now you're talking about multiple organisms and how they arrive at...
How we fit together,
How it all fits together is a sort of separate point in the sense that the inferences that win the competition are, of course, those that are also partially... there's a social pressure to select certain inferences. It's intersubjective, right? And it's also, because your beliefs influence my beliefs and so on. And then, but also my present sensory experience influences those inferences and so on. So all of the kind of stuff it's all interdependently influencing the mathematical formula that leads to the selection of which inferences win the competition for the reality model. But the coherence that I'm speaking of is that we have this current reality model and the unconscious process, the inferential competition, is constrained by the current reality model in the sense that the new inferences have to cohere with that reality model. And so this allows us to constantly have a kind of unification. So I'll try to kind of bring that all together. So essentially, first you've got this simulation of a reality model. Active inference can satisfy this quite well. There's this inferential competition that selects which things become conscious and which things don't make it to consciousness, and that's determined by which inferences seem to best explain the causes of our sensory data. Now there's a really key step, which we call epistemic depth. And this is probably the most novel notion that we propose in the paper. And this is that the reality model loops back into the inferential hierarchy, back into this inferential competition. So the system is, the brain is full of loops, full of feedback loops all throughout. It's all top down, bottom up. It's constantly sharing information with itself all over the place. It's the prefrontal cortex is widely connected throughout the brain. The occipital cortex is widely connected, and so there's sort of specialization hubs and then broad integration hubs, and there's a lot of ways with which the brain kind of communicates with itself, and has multiple of these complex loops kind of running all the time. So epistemic depth is when we recursively take that reality model, and not we, but the brain takes this reality model and shares it with itself. So it generates this reality model, which then is shared throughout the system. And what this means is that the existence of the reality model is shared throughout the system and becomes part of its underlying inferential process. So now you get this very interesting thing where there's this inferential competition that gives rise to the reality model. And that reality model is shared with the inferential architecture underlying the reality model, giving rise again to the reality model. What this now logically means, because of this epistemic depth, this loop in the system, is that the reality model contains the knowledge of its own existence, because the reality model is constantly being confirmed and evidenced by itself. So the reality model becomes part of the inferential competition that makes it into the reality model itself. So the reality model contains a model of itself. It's very loopy, and
it's loop over loop over loop over
and
loop.
It's but what, the thing to appreciate is that it's kind of, many predominant models of consciousness have been tempted towards a kind of metacognition, that there's this sort of like that there's they kind of agree that there's this modeling process that gives rise to, let's say, our world model, our reality model, but then they just say, oh well, consciousness is just a layer on top of that knows it, you see. But that doesn't ring true for the phenomenology of consciousness at all. It doesn't feel like something meta. It feels something like truly intimate. It feels like it's there inside all of the contents that we experience. It feels like it's there in the observation itself. It feels like it's everywhere. Consciousness feels like it's everywhere. And in these minimal states of consciousness, we can have this pure consciousness. There's nothing meta about a pure consciousness state, which is reported by contemplatives all over the world. So when you take this phenomenology seriously, I think this loop does a much better job than something meta, because the reality model is shared with the underlying process of its own reconstruction. So the consciousness, the knowing that it knows, is something that's like a revelation that's in the very architecture that gives rise to the reality model. The reality model already in its emergence contains the knowledge of its own existence, because it's constantly sharing the fact of its own existence with the system.
Sorry, that's a different. I've just thought occurred to me. That's a new way of putting it. That consciousness is fundamental, because you hear it from every corner. Consciousness is fundamental, but the way you describe it gives it a completely different spin, actually,
yeah,
isn't it?
Exactly.
That that's inherent basically in the system already. That's what you're saying, right? So we're saying consciousness is fundamental. Oh yeah, it's already part of the system.
Well, it's part of the reality model. It is fundamental in the sense that it's sort of something that emerges out, what seems to emerge out of the function, this sort of looping process, this creative, constant looping process. At least to us, it seems to be a logical sort of outcome of this kind of loop. And many people have talked about this. I mean, Douglas Hofstadter famously talked about the strange loop and so on. But I think what we've uniquely kind of done here is explain these three conditions: the inferential competition, the reality model, and how that reality model loops back into the inferential competition to go back into the reality model. And so it makes it kind of this, it does make it fundamental. It does, but it's also a middle way, in the sense that it's not meta, but it's not idealism in the sense that consciousness is primitive. It's just in the function itself. It's in the loop itself. It's inherent to the looping and the sharing of information throughout the system. And I think for us, this feels much more phenomenologically resonant. It's mathematically tractable because the output of the system simply becomes like the input of the inferential process itself. So you can conceive of an artificially intelligent system doing this. And it's also something that the brain can actually do and seems to be doing, because it clearly is capable of creating this reality model. And it's clearly sharing information all throughout the system at multiple levels of scale. And so it seems obvious to me that this reality model is constantly being confirmed by the system itself and constantly being shared throughout the system, and therefore becoming part of the continuous process that gives rise to the reality model itself. And so the other thing that's like hard to appreciate this, it feels like it's these steps, these sort of separate steps. But what I want to get across, and we have a lot of nice metaphors in the paper to kind of help understand this, and it makes much more sense mathematically. But there's a kind of this loop of inference, reality model creation, and sharing of the reality model is just constant. It's continuous. It's like the feedback of the sound out of a speaker and a microphone, and then you just kind of get this continuous loop. And so it's not something that has this sort of there's no kind of separation in the process of this this knowing and this knowing that it knows, but there does seem to be degrees to which a system can be conscious, right? We can be kind of minimally conscious in some states, and then kind of maximally intensely, or what we call luminously conscious. So we use this term luminosity to talk about the continuum of awareness, not as something that's meta, but as something that can turn up in brightness or luminosity, as is used in contemplative traditions. And we propose that this luminosity, or the intensity of consciousness, is determined by the intensity of this reflexive loop, the intensity, or specifically the precision with which this reality model is shared with the underlying architecture. Because when the reality model is emphasized, then it plays a stronger role in its reemergence of course, it's not a reemergence because it's a continuous process, but it plays a stronger role in the reality model. It wins the inferential competition, you could say. And then, therefore, the reality, the conscious aspect, the knowing that we know, gets boosted. And in a way, this is what we're doing in meditation. This is potentially what psychedelics are doing, which gives us this sense of expanded consciousness, which is just that we're looping on our reality model more strongly than we normally are. That doesn't make anything that we experience true, but it just makes us really have this feeling of like being conscious. And this is also, we find this empirically. So we find that people are, show higher mindfulness after taking psychedelics. That they literally feel more conscious. I mean, this is the part of the psychedelic experience that people haven't been able to explain, which is that you actually feel like you're entering a higher state of consciousness, or a more expanded state, or that there's more consciousness present. And what we're saying is potentially that's actually true if psychedelics are increasing epistemic depth, and if meditation and certain meditation states can potentially do that as well. But ultimately, meditation can even deconstruct the loop itself. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. One of your core interests is brain plasticity and inner transformation. What role do insight and subjective experience play in inner transformative process, also in the light of your theory? And what are the key cognitive deconstruction and construction practices? You already mentioned some, but maybe we group the question together.
Yeah.
The insight, inner transformation, subjective experience, cognitive deconstruction, and cognitive construction practices.
Yeah, I mean, insight is really Something that fascinates me, that's what my PhD was actually on, was insight experiences. And I got
this insight is this oh really, that's what we mean by insight, right? So that this aha
exactly.
thing.
Yeah, like a sudden revelation, a sudden aha moment, eureka moment. We can also even think of potentially mystical experiences as kind of really big insight moments. Then you can have contemplative insight moments. You can have the kind of insight moments that are new ideas. You can have insight moments that are more experiential. So it's a broad category, but generally, what I'm getting at there is a kind of non-linearity and non-linear discovery. That is, you go from one state to a sudden discovery of a new state in the system, and that could be a new state in the terms of a new idea or a creative piece of art. Or it could be like a new discovery about the nature of consciousness, or about your own experience, or about who you are. And I got fascinated in this because I found that in my life, insight moments seem to kind of mark the big transitions. And so whenever I had a big transition in my life, I felt like it was marked by insight moments. And I had this sort of meta thing going on where I was, thinking, well, what's going on with insight? This seems to be the key mechanism, or at least seems to be happening at the moment when those big changes take place. So presumably, if we understand insight, we learn about how human minds transform and what's going on there. And so that's why I decided to do a PhD on that. And I'm still really active in the insight field, which surprisingly has more than a century of research on it, and a real resurgence of research happening now, particularly because of psychedelic research and meditation. So it's a really exciting field. Insight is key because insight represents a restructuring of the system in some fundamental way. And so what this was originally called by the Gestalt psychologists who first became interested in insight is a kind of restructuring of our Gestalt. You could say that's like a restructuring of our reality model that allows us to now see things in a new way. So the insight is this restructuring of our reality model, permitting us to have a new perspective on reality.
Upgrading the loop of your system. That's what what insight is, or what?
Exactly. Well, it's upgrading. It's not necessarily upgrading, because you can have false insights as well. So a lot of my research is in false insights. So insight is simply the experience of that change, of a sudden change in the reality model, a kind of non-linear change in the reality model. I think that's a beautiful kind of new definition of insight, actually. And so insights are, of course, super important because they show us that something has changed. And there's a lot of interesting things that we can do there, and interesting research questions that we can ask. One is, how can we have more insights? Another question is, when, how, and what causes false insights? Another one is, why do we believe our insights to be true? There's this interesting thing that comes with insight, is that we immediately feel that it's true whenever we have this insight experience, and we kind of run with that insight. And of course, this is evolutionary adaptive, because if you're running away from a lion on the savannah and you need to figure out what the hell to do, and you're having insight moments, you need to trust the insight and act on it quickly, right? To climb up the tree or turn around and throw a rock or whatever. And so we heuristically, in a way, use these feelings of insight to select what we believe is true, but this can go wrong in all sorts of ways. We can have false insights, we can elicit false insights, and we have done on multiple occasions elicit false insights in the lab. We can make people feel things are true that are not true just by making an insight happen at the same moment. So the insight, again, is a kind of construction. It's just a change in the reality model that we feel to be true. Not necessarily true, but fortunately, most of the time true. And we can show this with like problem-solving tasks and so on in the laboratory. And this is well replicated, very strong effect size. On average, the feeling of insight tends to map onto accurate ideas, but there's a good proportion of them that do end up being false. And it may well be that in certain states of mind that the number of false insights can increase. So for example, we recently published a paper on psychedelics called False Insights and Beliefs Under Psychedelics. The model is called PHIBUS. And we explain how psychedelics, which elicit a lot of insight experiences because they induce this malleability in the system, also thereby, by virtue of this malleability in the reality model, make false insights, make us more prone to false insights. They make the reality model more flexible to change, but it doesn't in any way guarantee that that reality model is going to change in a way that leads to, adaptive insights. Truth is, of course, very hard to pin down, but we can make that estimate probabilistically, because if your past learning is somehow constraining your mind to have valuable insights, and you're only having a certain number of insights which are constrained by your past learning, if you're suddenly making the system more malleable and having a whole lot of insights, if you think about the extreme, if you make your reality model so malleable that it's just constantly changing and having all kinds of insights, you can infer that there's going to be more false insights just probabilistically there. If you're having 1,000 insights rather than 2 insights, the 1,000 insights is probabilistically going to have more false insights. So we can say that as psychedelics make the system more malleable and they're having more insights, we can also infer that probably a higher proportion of those are going to be false. And so this is a risk worth taking a lot of the time, because there's lots of meta insights that you can have about the malleability of the system, for instance, and how there's all these alternate sort of states of consciousness. These are, I think, the real value, but it's still also very valuable for someone who might be stuck in a state of mind that's unhelpful. So entering a state of high malleability, having a lot of insights to get us out of a particular rut that we're in, let's say if the system is in a depressed state or so on, can be really powerful. But I think we need to be really cautious about false insights. So, insights are at the heart of change. They're at the heart of the reality model of changing. They're at the heart of how we come to new creative solutions and technological breakthroughs. They're at the heart of contemplative insights, and contemplative insights tend to be slightly different in terms of definition. So contemplative insights tend to point towards a kind of more direct discovery of the process of the mind. So you mentioned the construction, deconstruction mode. So usually when we think of an insight, it's a kind of discovery of some new idea, some sort of new content. But the contemplative insight is more about discovering a process, discovering about somehow how the mind is actually constructing itself. And again, as we talked about earlier, we tend to go through this process of those 4 levels of deconstruction, from the narrative to the embodied to the witnessing and to the pure conscious. And through this deconstructive process and the reconstructive process of these layers, we get to learn about how the mind actually works. And this is a different kind of insight because it's meta. You're actually observing the mind and how it functions. So contemplative insights are a slightly different category to the kinds of insight that we might ordinarily have, because they're kind of process insights. They're insights about how the mind actually works. And we can have false insights in that domain, and even all insights are empty in some way. So we can never actually fundamentally know how everything works. So, we have to hold all insights lightly, even contemplative insights. But they do seem to be slightly different, again, because of this constructive, reconstructive process and how they reveal how that actually happens.
If we look at it at your results of your research from point of view of materialist, reductionist, physicalist science, do they offer any explanation for what you saw or what you registered, the results you have?
So the question is, does our findings support a materialist, reductionist model? Yeah. I want to say kind of yes and no. I think the materialist reductionist take on things in this particular case for cessation could work. It could work. I can see someone who has a materialist worldview saying, for instance, that, well, what happened is that the meditation leads to a process where it desynchronizes neural activity, and this desynchronized neural activity leads to a failure in information integration in the brain, which leads to a failure to bind together a reality model, which leads to breakdown in the reality model, which leads to unconsciousness. And you can just explain that in terms of the way that neurons communicate with each other. So that's a kind of that's kind of satisfying at a certain level. But because I know what you guys do here at the Essentia Foundation, you're kind of thinking a little bit deeper than that when you say materialist. And if you take it to the extreme, nobody knows what we mean by matter. And when you go deep into matter, you don't find matter, you find something else. So I don't say that it supports the materialist worldview, because I don't think there's support for the materialist assumptions, full stop, in how science has developed. I think if you pay any attention to quantum physics, and even if you take a more computational lens like I do, you don't really need to take on materialist assumptions per se. And I just don't think the way that science is going and the cutting edge findings are supporting what we imagine when we talk about a materialist worldview, because no one can tell you what matter actually is fundamentally. And so the answer is kind of two parts. In some sense, yes, there's a kind of coherent neural explanation that sounds materialist, but ultimately it's not materialist, because underneath that explanation is something that is not matter, in my view. What is sort of implied by your question is this sense that there is mind and matter as some sort of different phenomena, and somehow mind is when we say the cessation happens, mind is somehow taking control of matter, and therefore taking control of the processes that even give rise to the mind itself, or something like this. But there's a few kind of, I would say, assumptions built in there. So let's take first this radically interdependent view that I took before, that everything is kind of dependent on everything else in some fundamental way, that this reality model that is a cornerstone, or as we say, a condition for consciousness, needs to be bound together. There has to be the inferential competition, or the inferential process of the mind has to come to this coherent reality model, which is then looped to give rise to a conscious experience. If you take this perspective, then what cessation is just setting up the conditions where the reality model breaks down. And if there's no reality model, there's no loop, and then there's no experience of consciousness. So there's no need to think of mind controlling matter, because as you go deeper into the meditation as well, the meditation starts to do itself. The deconstruction deepens. There's a deconstruction of the different components of the reality model, and then the inference of the reality model breaks down such that a cessation happens. So you're just setting up the conditions for cessation. It's not something you do. So also when you talk to the meditators, what you do is you're actually just deconstructing, when Buddhism, what's called the five aggregates, which you can say is you take our reality model, including our experience, our thoughts, our perceptions, our sensations, and our experience of consciousness itself. And you actually start to just deconstruct these components of the mind. What you then get is a breakdown in the reality model, because you're gathering evidence against your reality model. You're just deconstructing it. And if the reality model breaks down, the loop breaks down, and then there's no consciousness. So it's not that there's some little agent, or the mind is taking control of matter. It's just deconstructing its own reality. And if you deconstruct your own reality, it breaks down. And if it breaks down, you lose consciousness. But it reemerges, fortunately.
So you, as a meditator, how far have you gone? Have you gone to cessation of consciousness stage, or what's the best story you can share with us from your own meditation practice?
So, I have experienced these things that I've speak of. Probably you can tell that I speak from experience, because it allows me to talk about phenomenology in a different way. So all of these things essentially that I've been speaking of, I have some experience with, but I don't, and I can speak about those experiences, but ultimately, those are just events in the unfolding. They're not that important. So I don't look backwards to point to something that's really true. You see what I mean? I look to just what I'm experiencing right now. And so the most profound and deep experience is what I'm always experiencing, I think. And of course, there has been these important transition moments where something feels like it fundamentally shifts. And for me, the most profound shifts have been those various, I think it's kind of come out in my description in some sense. There's these different levels of the self that we go through, from the narrative to the experiencing, to the witnessing, to the pure consciousness. And when you recognize yourself as something much more pure, as this sort of witness, this pure presence, this sort of background of the reality model itself, this is a profound discovery at a certain point. And this does change the way you look at things quite dramatically. And this all it's funny because all of these stages of insight, in a way, feel like the end. They can feel so profound, and they can feel so important that they feel like the end. And all of them, I've most of the time made that mistake. And so each of these were really important. I would say there was something really fundamental about having going through this sort of cessation process. And again, not because of going unconscious, but because of the reset. There's this like waking up into a new reality. And to me, this was dramatically changed my experience of things, and dramatically changed how I feel myself, and dramatically changed how I relate to things. In a profoundly positive way, I would say. And that's also not some sort of end state, because then there's also this other thing that I was talking about, where you really have the insight into this cessation, which is kind of paradoxical. And there's this sort of there's this real sort of letting go, even of the kind of duality between the formless and the form, or the kind of deeply deconstructed states like cessation, and the breaking down even of those very sort of subtle dualities between the preferences that we develop for profoundly formless states and what is actually just our ordinary experience. So there's this kind of like weird re-emergence with just being just a totally ordinary that is sort of inexplicable, but is this sort of, in a way, forgetting the whole path itself. It's all just kind of gone, and that's why it doesn't even make sense, in some sense, to reify or make past experiences important, because they're not. They're just memories that are appearing in my kind of mind right now. So these are all of these phases are important, and all of these unfoldings continue. And I don't feel that there's any kind of conclusion to the unfolding. I think the unfolding keeps going. I think my own unfolding keeps going, and I'm excited to and curious to keep learning from other people and to share with others. And I have no sense that there's any kind of end to this, or that there's something special about me. And that being said, I will also say that there is something fundamentally important, and there are transitions that have finality to them, and they're worth pursuing, and it's good. A lot of people make the thing really dramatic, and there are periods of this that are deeply dramatic and deeply spiritual and deeply even mystical and deeply energetic, and you change its like physiological levels, it seems to me, as a consequence of these things that happen. But the real part to me that's interesting and valuable is the freedom to be ordinary, the freedom to be what you are, and then the freedom to not like just like you have to be ordinary. You can also be special. There's also that. You can also be extraordinary in that sense. But it's just this less of a less constraints in the system or preference for particular states of being, or even prioritization of different states of being. So I think this is what I can say about that. Yeah.
Ruben, I like quoting people,
Mm-hmm.
and I have a quote for you, specially prepared. I hold a deep respect for both the scientific method and the wisdom traditions, which form an ideal marriage in an authentic pursuit of truth. Neither the mind nor the heart alone can make us whole. That's an opening statement from your website. What beautiful quote of yours. So, what is the future of science and education in this context? Can we really marry the scientific method and wisdom traditions?
Yeah. I really think we can. I think we have to. I think that's what we're more and more recognizing, that you cannot make genuine scientific progress unless you have genuine expertise with experience itself. Phenomenological science, you could say. And I think, this is what many of us have realized. And this is also why I have this obsession, or that I celebrate predictive processing and active inference. Because what these are, we need a new language. We need a new language that bridges this gap between third person and first person experience. We're stuck in this bizarre duality as a society, where we're caught between believing that there's this phenomenological reality and then some other reality that works completely differently, and that there's no way to talk about them with a single language. Whereas I think there are groups of us who are recognizing that there are shared languages that bridge the phenomenological and the third person, that allow us to talk about reality in an objective scientific way, that allows us to build things like artificial intelligence, using a language that bridges phenomenology and the kind of reductionist, materialist, third person perspective in a way that I think is profoundly more accurate, profoundly more satisfying, and I think it is going to be the future of the way that we actually model even physics, in the way that we actually do physics, I suspect, eventually, but certainly in the way that we do mind sciences and the way that we come to understand ourselves. I think the marriage between contemplative traditions and science is absolutely the future of science. And I think this is where we're going to have breakthroughs, not only in improving our understanding of how to be happier, how to reduce suffering, how to become wiser, but also in the domain of deep tech and AI and machine learning and neuroscience. It's going to come out of these bridges. And these are not visions that are mine, but are visions that many scientists have had, like Francisco Varela and many others before and after him, to find a bridge between the third person and the first person. And I think there's a generation of scientists who are doing this now, and I think this is where we're going to see some really amazing breakthroughs.
Ruben, thank you very much for this interview. Whenever you are back in Amsterdam, please let us know. We would love to chat with you in person again.
Absolutely. I'll be back for sure. I love Amsterdam, and I really appreciate what Essentia Foundation and yourself are doing. I think it's really cool. I think it's like bringing a conversation to the scientific field that's been sorely missing. Even though I'm kind of not on the idealist group, I think it's just such an important conversation for us to be having, because I think those arguments are much stronger than the reductionist materialists appreciate. But as you can see, I'm sort of advocating for some sort of middle way, and I'd love to keep having that conversation with you and Essentia in the future. So thanks so much for having me. This has been a pleasure.
Thank you. And just a practical, which of your works or publications or papers would you like us to make, or should people should know about?
Well, I think just it would be great if to just go to my website. It's just rubenlaukkonen.com, because there I have links to my papers. including the recent theory paper on consciousness, which I'm really excited about, but I think it's also very technical. So you've got to kind of be into that stuff. But I also have a Substack, which is much less technical normally, where I try to bridge these, a way of kind of writing or talking about reality in a unified language that brings experiential insights and analytic, conceptual, or scientific insights into a single narrative, let's say, and you can kind of just sign up for free there, and then I send out like an email or a blog post every month or so where I try to talk about something interesting.
Excellent.